Welcome to West Coast to East Coast, your podcast on the latest news in Canadian immigration and the latest tips on the IELTS, CELPIP, and PTE Core language proficiency tests. My name is Maria, and I'm a certified Canadian English teacher and language exam expert here to help you get the band scores you need.
And my name is Olena Weber, and I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant.
What are we talking about today, Olena?
Well, today we're talking about really how formal immigration process is and all the formalities involved in this process. So hopefully people can prepare better for submitting their immigration application and, of course, preparing for their English exam.
That sounds like a great topic today. I've got 3 tips as well for your language proficiency test in terms of formality and your tone of voice. So let's get started.
Yeah, let's do it. Do you want to first talk about immigration?
Immigration or language tests?
It's up to you. We can cover language tests.
Okay, well, let's get started with the language tests. Okay. I've got 3 tips for tone on your speaking or even writing tests. For the writing tests, specifically task 1 on the IELTS general training test or the CELPIP test. Now, tip number 1 is that we really want to discern who you are speaking to. This is really important, especially on the CELPIP test. On the CELPIP test, we're going to be talking to somebody, right? On the CELPIP test, there are 8 speaking tasks. And on some of those tasks, you have to speak directly to somebody, right? So on some of the tasks like task 1 or task 5, the candidate, the test taker has to speak directly to somebody. So we really have to determine who it is that they're talking to. It might be a friend or a manager. So what I always tell my students is to really figure out who it is that they're talking to and then adjust their speaking style, their tone of voice to that person. Is it going to be formal or informal? And the examiners are assessing whether or not they were able to adjust their speaking style, their tone of voice accordingly. So you can do that by adjusting your intonation and your language. If you're talking to your manager, you're going to want to sound more professional. So have a more professional tone of voice, and your language should also adjust. If you're talking to a friend, you're going to want to sound a little bit more bubbly, a little bit more lighthearted than if you're speaking to a manager. And your language, it can also be much more informal. So that's if you're talking to a friend. Now,
why did you say that it's more important or especially important for CELPIP test?
It's also important when I'm talking about the speaking test because on the IELTS speaking test, you're just talking to an examiner, right? So you're just having a conversation.
Oh, yes. I didn't think of that. Yes.
They don't really assess tone of voice on the IELTS speaking test. You're just talking with an examiner. You're having a natural conversation with an IELTS examiner. So they're not really assessing your tone of voice on the IELTS speaking test. They're not putting you in these hypothetical situations where you have to be creative and imagine that you're talking to somebody. On the IELTS speaking test, there are 3 parts, and they're just asking you about your thoughts, about your opinion, and about really experiences in your life. So you're just having a conversation with the person in front of you. It shouldn't sound super informal, but just a natural conversation. Whereas on the CELPIP speaking test, they put you in these pretend scenarios where you have to speak to either a friend, a coworker, or a manager, and you have to then really adjust your speaking style according to the person that you're going to be speaking to. And that is a really, really big part of the assessment. So that's tip number 1, to adjust your speaking style, your tone of voice to who you are speaking to. Is it formal or informal? Tip number 2 is to adjust your tone of voice, your speaking style to the situation. Your tone of voice should also be appropriate for the situation. For example, on the CELPIP test in task 1, they have to give advice. Okay, so you might have to give advice to a friend who has to decide on whether they are going to go to university after graduating from high school or look for a job. Now, that's a pretty serious decision, right? Or it might be that they're planning a birthday party. Two totally different situations. One is much more serious than the other. So the language you're going to use and the advice you're going to give is going to be much more serious in one scenario than the other. So the examiners are going to be assessing whether or not you adjust your intonation and the language according to how serious the situation is. That also applies for example, task 6 on the CELPIP speaking test, where you're dealing with a difficult situation. Candidates must be able to adjust their speaking style according to the severity of the situation. And that taps into our topic today, which is how formal should you be? My third tip is a pretty unique tip that I highly doubt people will hear on YouTube or find on Google or anything, because it's a pretty examiner style tip. It's to be consistent with your tone of voice throughout your entire response. Now, this applies for the CELPIP and the IELTS and even the PTE core. Now, what do I mean by being consistent with your tone of voice throughout your entire response? Remember that with tone of voice, you want to adjust your speaking style according to who you are speaking to and the situation. Now, we want to stay consistent from the beginning of our response all the way through until the end of the response. We don't want to start formal if it's a formal context, and then in the middle start sounding informal, and then at the end go back to formal. It has to stay consistent. And a lot of test takers, they throw in a sentence or two that just sounds a little bit too academic or too formal for the context. So we really have to make sure, or students and test takers have to make sure that it really stays consistent to whoever it is that they're talking to. So that's
Yeah,
a really
that totally
good tip.
makes sense. Do you see in like within your experience and maybe your students that this can be a challenge for some? Like, do some people struggle with just generally with formality? Like in
I see that
speaking?
this is a really huge one because tone of voice is one of the most subtle aspects of learning a language. And it also, culture also starts to creep in here.
That's right.
Yeah, I think culture is also something that starts to affect a learner, when they're learning a new language. When I was learning Portuguese, I remember that it was really hard for me to tell if something was sarcastic or not, or if an expression was formal or not. And I only really started to learn those subtleties and those differences over many years, after many years of being in the country, because those things you learn, like what's appropriate to say in a certain context or not, or what is professional and what is not, and certain expressions, when to use those. Is that something you would say only with a friend, or can you say that in a workplace setting? Those things come with experience. So I think that is something that is really more of like an upper level, tone of voice is something that really upper level or higher level students are familiar with or come naturally to. And also there are some things that come across as a little bit too academic, or they seem a little bit even rude sometimes. Like just when you're making a request, for example, like I was editing somebody's task 1 letter for the IELTS, for IELTS general training. And just the way that they were making a request, they said like, I need this. But it's more polite to say for like, I would like to request, or I would kindly like to request, instead of I need. Now, there's nothing incorrect in terms of the English to say I need to do that. I need you to get me this. But it's just more polite to say I would like to kindly request. So in comes the Canadian part of me, who, Canadians are very polite and a bit passive aggressive as well, where we want everything to be very polite and kind. So when you're making requests, especially if you're talking to management or contacting a store or something, you want to massage everything and to make everything very kind and polite and discreet. You don't want to be aggressive or demanding or to bother anybody. So the way you want to write should be aligned with the culture as well. So tone of voice does kind of cross that boundary as well. And that's when it starts to become a cultural difference as well, because your country might be very direct. The way you communicate in your home country might be like, get me this, or I need this.
Yeah, it's not. I think it's just the way our language may be structured, because yes, it's like totally normal to say like, we would even in a regular conversation, like friendly conversation, we would say like, oh, I would like to go to the park this weekend. When in Ukrainian, you would always say like, you would never say I would like to, you would say like, I want to go to the park, right? So it's like more, you know what I mean?
Okay,
like
more
it's
direct.
not that much difference, but still it's like, I want, I need, I have to, like those strong verbs.
More impactful.
Yes, more impactful, more strong. And that's why people, even with good level of English, like I have a friend who has probably around, like I would say CLB 8.
Okay.
But it's not like, it's exactly what you're saying. She's not saying it wrong. It's not wrong what she's saying.
Not wrong.
But it just comes across so different,
Yes. So in like, that's a perfect example. If say your friend is writing a task 1 letter, in whether it's the IELTS test, general training, or the CELPIP test. And let's say she's asking a request to a manager. In Ukrainian, she might say, I want this. But if you say, I want to your manager, I want a day off.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. Day off.
I want a day off. That's very, it's very like assumptive. Like, I demand a day off. I deserve a day off. Your manager's going to be like, hello, you have to request. So I would like to request a day off. You have to word it in a way where you're requesting it. And so in comes tone of voice, in comes learning how to make requests. And so that could come across as rude. And so we have to learn different ways of making polite requests, how to make it, even learning how to complain politely.
Yeah.
I can give even a subtle cultural difference. When I go to the United States, I'm not saying Americans are rude. Nobody listening, I hope nobody listening to this interprets it this way. I'll just say that when I go to the United States, I notice the way that I speak, people assume that I'm too polite. I'll probably say it that way, not that Americans are rude. I'll give you an example. When I go to Starbucks or any coffee shop in the States, when I order coffee, I say, may I please get, or may I please order a, may I please have a, blah, blah, blah. And then I hear somebody next to me, not everybody, but somebody say, get me a, or I'll have a, or I'll get a this, or get me a this. In Canada, if you say, get me a this, get me a large coffee, it's very rude. It's very aggressive. Like, get me a large coffee. The person will be like, woo. And I remember I was in Florida and I said, like, may I please order a large coffee? They were like, oh, you must be Canadian. They were like right away very shocked by the way I had ordered. Yeah. And I was like, oh, how'd you know? They're like, oh, just the way you ordered your drink. It just kind of stood out. And I thought, okay, so it's just the tone, right? Again, I'm not saying anybody's more rude or anything. It's just the way people might order something. I think Canadians are probably too polite. I think that's probably what it is. We're always kind of trying to make everything nice. That's probably
I totally get it. I really feel it when we travel to Europe with my husband, who's born in Canada, and I really feel it because it's like it almost becomes very annoying that he's like too polite. I'm like, nobody cares here. Like in Europe, nobody cares.
Just get what you want, get it over with. Let's go. See, even now I'm being so nice. I'm scared about hurting anyone's feelings that I'm like, please don't think I'm being rude. Case in point, perfect example. I'm like trying to prevent any conflict at all points. Anyway, so those are my 3 tips just to sum them up. Number 1, make sure that you are addressing the person that you are speaking to appropriately with an appropriate tone of voice. Great tip, not just for your test, but for everyday life, formal versus informal. Tip number 2, adjust your speaking style to the situation. You don't want to sound happy-go-lucky if it's a serious situation, like maybe somebody just got laid off. You want to adjust. Oh, have empathy. Really drop your tone of voice and, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Or if they're planning a party, get really excited. And tip number 3, consistency. Make sure that your tone of voice is consistent from the top to the bottom of your writing response or from the beginning to the end of your speaking response. So really helpful 3 tips there for your speaking test and for everyday life. Over to you, Olena, for your 3 tips, or any tips. I don't know if you have 3, we might have more.
Yes, I do have 3.
Okay, for
I do have 3
immigration.
tips, yes, for applicants who are preparing their documents for permanent residency. So tip number 1 is, it's just the most painful tip to me, because I really want everybody's application for PR to look very formal and very professional, right? We don't want permanent residence application. It's an extremely serious application that can impact your and your family's life, right? It literally decides your destiny. And I definitely don't want your application to look like it was just, shot on the phone in a bad light, and, the documents are not properly scanned or not readable. So I always say, please don't use any cam scans, so like those scanning apps, or even pictures on the phone for your PR application, just because not only it's sometimes not like properly readable or blurry, but also it's not really looking very professional, because don't forget about it, is that immigration officers, they're also people. Mm-hmm. And they really get an impression when they receive your overall application document. And if it looks like, somebody stepped on that document and then took a picture of it, which actually happened in real life with one of my clients. Like, I received a document. It was a very important document. It was a notarized permission for his child to immigrate to Canada, like permanent residency. And on that, like, not only saying that it was like super crumbled in like one piece, and then somebody tried to even it out. Also, it was like an actual footprint, like of like, like somebody stepped on it. And I'm like, what happened? And then he said that, oh, I was going from the notary and I dropped it and I stepped on it. And I was like, why? Like, why this is happening? And I said, but also the scan was really bad, so you couldn't really read it. So I asked to rescan it, like the footprint was still there, but yeah, like obviously we don't want that because as I said, immigration officers, they're still people, right? And it's not a great impression. So that's number 1. Please make sure that you scan properly. You can go to like Staples or any other store, and for very low price, you can scan your documents properly. Make sure that everything looks professional. Number 2 is that if you need to write a letter of explanation for permanent residency, and by the way, not everybody is required to write a letter of explanation. You should write letter of explanation for your PR application only if there is like actually something to explain, because sometimes people treat explanation letter for PR application kind of like cover letter, why I want to come to Canada, when actually that's just really not needed. You're supposed to submit explanation letter only if there are like some issues with your PR application, like some inconsistencies or something not clear or something like actually needs to be explained. And when you write this letter of explanation, of course, make sure that your grammar is good, right? That your English is good. It's clear. It's clearly explained. Like your points are actually clearly explained, and it is formal, because I've seen those letter explanations that start very informal and very just kind of like you're treating an immigration officer like a friend. And it's just, they're obviously not going to refuse your PR application because you phrased your letter wrong, but still, it may just not be a great, like in combination with badly scanned documents and then like poorly written explanation letter, when you say like, hey, to the officer, like it's just not a great impression, like not a great look for your PR application. So that's that. And then the third tip would be to actually pay attention to your formality of your documents, and specifically it would be your employment letters. So almost for every immigration program, you're required to submit proof of your work experience, and that would come in a form of employment letter or a job offer. So there are very, very strict rules on how you should, or your employer should write those letters, and how your employer should phrase certain things and indicate certain details about your employment. So just make sure that you follow all of the guidelines, and for different programs there are different guidelines, but to make sure that you follow those. So for example, that you are required to indicate specific number of hours that you've been working, or you were working, number of hours per week that you were working in that job. So not just like a word full-time, and this is super common mistake that people would just indicate, like employers would indicate, this job was a full-time job. But the government really wants to see 40 hours per week or 30 hours per week or whatever it was. And clients a lot of times, or during the consultations, I have an argument, but it says full-time. But I'm like, okay, but full-time in China can mean something different than full-time in Canada, and something different. And it's also like place of employment, like maybe full-time at, I don't know, like one company can be something different than full-time in another company, right? Like nobody knows what full-time is. So like for immigration to Canada, like in terms of immigration programs, full-time is 30 hours per week, right? When like in our like actual everyday life, we would consider full-time like 40 hours per week, right? Like just on a mental level, like you would always think it's like 8 hours per day, right?
Yeah.
So that's saying like that full-time is just not enough. You need to indicate proper number of hours. And of course your responsibilities, your employer needs to indicate your title, your period of work, of actual day, month, and a year, not just month and a year. Also, another common mistake is that people indicate only month and a year, but you need an actual date. Then what else? Responsibilities, title, salary, or wage. So those are like super important things. And if one of those elements is missing, which happens a lot, it's very often that one of those elements is missing, then there is a very big chance that your application will be refused. So that is very important, to be detail oriented, and that document, employment letters, those documents are super formal. And you should really, and of course the language, because even employment letters, a lot of times I see them being written with a lot of grammar mistakes, which I'm not sure like why this is happening, but like definitely if your HR issues employment letter, like make sure you read it, make sure it makes sense grammatically to you, because grammar in employment letter, that actually is something that when English can impact your whole life. So grammar in employment letter can actually impact the outcome of your immigration case. Because, for example, if grammatically the person puts a wrong grammar, saying that like so-and-so has been working for this company since, July 1st, 2023, that means that that person has been working and currently working in this company, right? But then if the grammar is wrong and it says is that like the person, took a position of operation analyst on July 1st, and then his salary is this, and that, then it doesn't clearly state that this person currently works. It says that it took the position of operation analyst, but it doesn't explicitly say that this person still works as an operation analyst. So this like really grammatical kind of mistake. It's not a mistake. It's a grammatical, I guess, change in just the grammar and just the way that the letter is phrased. It can cause problems. Because then immigration officer actually wouldn't understand. Okay, so does he still work as an operation analyst, or did he just take that position and then what happened? And so that can lead to
confusion.
Yeah, it is a confusion, and that happens a lot. And I've seen case refused literally because grammatical mistake of HR, and that was like such a bad, because in reality the case was absolutely perfect, but because the HR didn't phrase that properly, immigration officers simply said that based on your employment letter, we're not convinced that you have been working for the whole year at this position, because it was confusing the way they phrased it. And it was just refused, right? So the formality is super, super important. So yeah, just to summarize, please make sure you scan your documents properly. If you are in Canada, you can go to Staples if you don't have a scanner, or you can use your friend's scanner, but please make sure it's good quality. Then number 2 is make sure that your explanation letters are written professionally in a good tone of voice, that it's professionally addressing and clearly addressing all of the issues to be explained in terms of your PR application. And the third one is your employment letters. Make sure that your employment letters are covering all of the details as per government regulations, and that your employment letters are very, very clear on which position, when did you take that position, and your periods of employment, and that grammar is really, really clear when it comes to outlining your employment.
Sounds good. So
Yes.
these tips I think were really helpful to make sure that everybody's tone of voice and that their documents are on point, so that we don't get anything refused, or that their tests, get good scores and band scores. So what are we going to be talking about next week? I think next week's topic is going to be a fun one.
Yes, next week we will be talking about different provinces in Canada and which province is the most favorable for immigration, and also just for living and enjoying your life in Canada. So we will be just taking a little tour across all the provinces.
Yeah, awesome. So let's get started with that next week, and we hope to see you there. Bye, everyone.
Bye.